Shall we dive right in?
Jump right in. What do you want to ask me?
Well,
what will be painful?
I don't know about painful, but I'm just curious what your kind of initial response is after that kind of wondrous play we just saw.
For the people who haven't been through tech that is this agonizing, what's fascinating to me, I just got back from Europe, and so I'm actually like sleeping, and I realized that that's exactly what I do in tech too. Is the torture that these people are experiencing is so real, and which I find in and of itself was fascinating, and I was embarrassed for people because what they were doing is so truthful, particularly the meltdown about the rewrite.
We've both been there.
Yes, we've both been there.
Both been there.
With
yes.
people who are famous and Tony Award winning.
Yes, on all sides of the lights.
The meltdown happens because of the raw fear that you encounter when you get into tech, because there is no time. And the perception that it's done and yet not done leads to this raw fear, which leads to complete acting out. And there is a moment when you see everybody as they were in the fourth grade. And I mean that sort of facetiously, but quite honestly. There's someone that I've worked with who I described as Baby Herman from the old Roger Rabbit cartoons, who simultaneously is loud and cigar smoking and yelling at everyone, and then at the drop of a hat is suddenly in a diaper and crying with projectile tears.
Right.
And that's an experience that we go through a lot.
It is. Now, let's take a step back for a second, because one could say that you produce shows on the biggest stage of the world. Not only are you on Broadway, you're literally around the world, and you produce big, spectacular Broadway musicals. How does the tech process for one of those shows, just in kind of gross terms, compared to a little bit of what we saw today?
Well, I was thinking about that watching the show, because I remember in the middle of tech at New York Theater Workshop for Peter and the Starcatcher, and I turned to my colleague at the time, associate producer Michelle Steckler, and I said, shouldn't this be easier? We produce these giant shows that cost many, 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 many millions of dollars. And we've teched them in foreign languages. We've done these for, as you can imagine, if you have seen The Lion King, imagine teching a show that the whole world said was impossible to produce. And today, you just accept it like cats, right? Oh, it's just inevitable and it's there. But at the time, and I can look at some of you and know you weren't even alive probably, but at the time, it was thought to be completely impossible and wouldn't happen. And there was carnage all over the theater, and literally animals that never made it into the productions, all this stuff. And there was a lot of tears, and Miss Tamor had her gallbladder taken out on the first day of tech.
Oh my God.
And was in the theater in a recliner, in a Barcalounger, which she did not find out for a few years was actually called a Barcalounger. She thought we called it the Barcalounger because she barked on the godmother from it. Not kidding, she actually thought we'd nicknamed it. And so she couldn't even get up and run up on stage. So it was a very complicated tech.
Right.
But in the middle, which Michelle and I did that one too, and when in the middle of Peter and the Starcatcher, this small intimate play at New York Theater Workshop was just as difficult.
Right.
And that came as a huge surprise to me. And in fact, in the middle of that tech, on a rainy Sunday night, all the power went out in the theater. And I'd never worked off Broadway. I'd worked in the regional theater a lot, but I'd never worked off Broadway. And the power just went out. And the tech guy said, well, this happens sometimes here, we'll have to stop. I said, well, we can't stop. We have a preview. We can't stop. And they said, well, we have to call an electrician, and we can't get on stage. I said, well, do you have an electrician? He goes, yeah, we have a guy, but it costs $400. Well, this is an embarrassing story, but I'll tell you anyway. So I said, well, I'll just take out $400. And so I pulled $400 out of my pocket and said, get the damn electrician and we'll start again. And 45 minutes later, we'd start again. This had never happened in the history of New York Theater Workshop.
Sure, yeah.
Well, and you realize everybody's got their own economy and their own ability to do what they can do. And it's not any different than if you said, it's happened on Aladdin. and it meant getting a hydraulic valve and a thing, but we did that too. You have to do whatever you can to keep it going. And the room is the same no matter how big or small it is.
Well, that's kind of the fascinating thing that I noticed tonight, which is, you're watching this play and you're realizing that a tech process is a tech process no matter where you are, no matter what size, no matter what shape, no matter what budget you're dealing with, no matter if you're on Broadway or in a room like this.
But everyone imagines the other side of it.
It's
to
so
your
different.
introduction, that it's going to be easier, right?
Right.
Oh, it's little, that's easy to do. And then when you're in that scale, you think, oh, if I only had the money, well, that would be doable. But then, one show has 12 actors and one show has 52 actors. And then one show has so many tech tables, it feels like you're at NASA.
You get lost walking from
You can't.
stage left to stage right.
Actually, the bruised thigh line really made me laugh too, because everybody
Yeah,
is
it's true.
bruised to
It's true.
death.
Is there one moment on the many shows that you have produced during a tech rehearsal that you remember, besides the Barker Launder, or the Barker chair story, which I think is actually hilarious, that stands out in your mind of all the shows and of all the moments?
There's two, a high and a low.
Yeah.
On Lion King, at a very bleak moment, when it seemed undoable, because that show, by the way, had never done a run-through before the first audience. We'd never actually run through. This gentleman up here is gasping, thinking, that's not how I was taught. We actually had an audience, and we'd never seen the show from start to finish. We thought, well, let's go. Let's see what happens with an audience. Clearly, it worked out. But
Time well spent.
Heather Headley was downstage left. Everyone was freaked out, and she, it was just a really rough period, and she just quietly began to sing Summertime. And she has one of the most extraordinary voices. As you know, she won a Tony later for playing Aida in Aida. And she began to sing Summertime, and the entire theater fell silent. Every crew member, everybody just stopped. And she reset the emotional clock and cleansed the room. That's a high. The low was in London on Mary Poppins. Well, we were actually in Bristol on the out-of-town tryout. And Mary Poppins has many, many, many moving parts. And David Haig, who'd never done a musical,
Right.
you would know him from like Four Weddings and a Funeral. And David was stage right in Mr. Banks. He played Mr. Banks in his office. And a unit, a hanging unit for another scene, fell from about 15 feet, 20 feet above him. And it fell, it was a window, glass, and it fell and it smashed on the floor next to him. Now, had it been over 2 feet, it would have hit him in the head,
Okay, of course.
which happens. And he was so furious, he left and wouldn't come back and was gone for 2 days.
Those are two.
It's a high and a low.
That is a very high and a very low. I kind of wanted to open it up because I think it's almost more interesting to get questions from these guys because we talk to each other all the time. So do any of you guys have questions for Mr. Schumacher or myself about Broadway or tonight or anything?
Or we could sit and look at each other.
Well,
Yes, sir.
I'm curious about how your experiences before Broadway formed Broadway for you.
I was paid to do theater when I was 15 years old. I worked at a community center and somebody honestly left and they hired me, oddly. And I was sort of producing and directing my own work with young people, but I was quite young myself. And all I wanted to do is make theater, and I worked at the legendary Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles. There's a lot of Equity Waiver in LA, but I worked at the Mark Taper Forum, and I started there as a production assistant. So I've had the great good fortune to tape a lot of floors and sweep a lot of floors and wash a lot of coffee cups. And when I started doing work as a production assistant and a stage manager, I predate copy machines and computers.
It's hard to believe because he looks so good.
That's very thoughtful of you, Mike. So I literally would be I was the PA, which in LORT theater terms is second assistant stage manager, for Lanford Wilson on a play called The Tale Told, which is part of the Tally trilogy, which when it came to New York, the big production of it was Tally and Son. It's called Tale Told, and I literally had to take Lanford Wilson's handwritten notes in the side of the script and go type new pages. We actually, we did have copy machines, we didn't have collating copy machines. So you'd have to actually lay the pages out and then in stacks and go assemble them and then give them the new pages and do all of that. But to actually hand type someone else's stuff. Ted Chapin's version of that is even better in Everything Is Possible, his book. He talks about Sondheim giving him lyrics, by the way, which is great. And they didn't have a copy machine, and he had to type it. You can only have 10 pieces of carbon paper. So he could do 10 copies at a time and then retype the scene and retype the page and retype the page. But doing that kind of work, and then much smaller scale stuff, and then I took a weird sojourn into the animation business and raised you and gave you most of the values that you've grown up with.
Rest your senator.
Thank you. We'll always have that together. And so when we started 21 years ago, the first giant tech I'd ever been to was Lion King. So I was producing the show, Peter Chan and I were producing the show, and I'd never seen a tech so big. But for us, it was small, because we were making movies that cost $100 million. So thinking, well, if we screwed this up, how bad could it be? So everything has its own scale, and no matter what you do, it's terribly important to you, and you have to get it right. Because fundamentally, as you see tonight, it's all about people. No matter where you go, whether you're running an animation studio, which is all about people, even though what you see isn't people, it's all about people, and it's exactly like this. The same meltdowns, and so it's all about people, and how they feel, and how they make you feel, and all about the fourth grade. Long answer, short question. Yes?
Is there a type of project, and I don't mean like a specific show or anything like that, a type of project that you haven't yet worked on that you would love to? Like, do you go to bed and think, I wish I could do this sort of thing?
Well, I don't think of it as a type thing, but for example, you wouldn't have seen, I'm assuming, last summer I spent in London doing Shakespeare in Love.
Yeah.
Oh, did you see it?
Yeah.
And it's actually the best reviewed show in the history of Disney theatrical.
Yeah.
And it was a glorious thing. And working with Declan Donnellan, who I'd only read his book, The Target and everything. And so doing something like that, I hadn't thought about doing a type. I wanted to tell that story. And I was adamant that it not be a musical, which is what won Tom Stoppard over. And Tom worked on it, and Lee Hall wrote the piece using Tom's material, and Tom was with us all the time. And working with Sonia Friedman, who I adore, and to be able to do it with her, but it wasn't a type of show, it was a story I wanted to do. But the work is probably more diverse than you imagine, because I also sit in tech for ice shows.
Right.
We have a lot of ice shows out there, which are produced by Feld Entertainment, but those are ours too.
So then maybe the better question is, what's your favorite?
You have favorite bits and favorite moments. You can't not love The Lion King, right? For me, because because to me The Lion King is Julie, and so that's deeply moving. But I love a good turnaround, and I've had a few of those. And I actually have great affection for the flops. Great affection, because actually in both cases of our notorious flops, they both got reinvented and are really successful around the world, which is oddly gratifying, although unknown by the New York Times.
But it's known by those of us who matter.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you want to do one more?
One more? Yeah.
What have been your biggest challenges, translating film to theater?
It's an excellent question, because the interesting thing that is missed in every article ever written about this is when we have been our most successful, we haven't turned a pre-existing property into a musical. We've taken a musical and adapted it for another medium. And that's why, and it's a point that everyone misses, it's very difficult to take someone's story and say, or particularly like a film that's known for a title song, you can probably imagine 6 of these you've seen on Broadway that failed, because it's not a story that has music in its DNA. But our material, at whatever level, the ones that are musicals, not Peter and the Starcatcher, not Shakespeare in Love, the ones and the ones that are based on Disney IP, have music at their center. And even Aida is a story built around music. And Aida was actually based on a Leontine Price retelling of the Aida story that she used for her actor process, having done the opera. they have music in their base. In the case of Aladdin, if you've seen it, Aladdin film is an action-adventure movie. Howard Ashman and Alan Menken wrote a big, broad musical comedy and I was there for the whole experience of watching that go through the factory, if you will, and come out the other end as an action-adventure movie with some songs in it. But what Alan Menken did when we were developing the piece was, because we had never intended to have it be on Broadway. We were trying to develop a longer version for licensing in schools and stuff. And he said, well, why don't we look at the stuff that Howard did? And so he pulled out all of Howard Ashman's outlines and everything. So what James Monroe Iglehart does as the genie is not a reinterpretation of Robin Williams. That's actually what Howard wrote. It was Cab Calloway meets Fats Waller. And so the reason why it works, and it clearly worked for James, and it really works in the show, is that that's in the DNA. When the narrative is inherently musical, so then you get to, what makes something sing? Why does it sing? Or as Mary Rogers, rest her soul, would say, the why musical, when you go, why is that a musical? Because nothing about it wants to sing. We're working on Father the Bride right now, and based on the George Streeter novel and the film, we have the rights to the film and the novel, the film with Spencer Tracy and Elizabeth Taylor. And, well, that isn't a musical. But if you know the film, in the opening moment, as the book has this first-person narrative, and the opening moment of the film is Spencer Tracy in a monologue, looking right at the camera. Well, that's a song, right? That in and of itself is emotionally, he's using, that's like a song. So then you go, oh, I see the window in. But I look at a lot of other people's stuff and I think, oh, why is that a musical? Now, by the way, I've gotten it wrong. Like either hitting it wrong, taking the wrong approach, the wrong attack. But I think that it has distinguished where we've been successful, we've been extraordinarily successful because music is in it. You're waiting for them to sing, not wondering why they're singing. And also I think when we've been successful, we have used music. Lion King, to beat the corpse of that, but the Julie's first attack, Julie had never seen it. We had met 10 years before I called her. And in 1985, the movie came out in 1984. Were you alive in 94, sir? Oh.
My first movie in theaters.
What?
It was my first movie in movie theaters.
Really?
The Lion King.
You're welcome. And, but when I called Julie and said, would you want to do this? First, she'd never seen the movie. It was the biggest thing in the world, but she hadn't seen it. So I sent her, you remember the clamshell videos, right? Pre-DVD, and the soundtrack to the movie, and a second album called Rhythm of the Pride Lands, which was made by Lebo M, you know Lebo, and Hans Zimmer and Mark Mancina. And this was songs based on and things cut from the Lion King and all that. And it was the music that gave Julie her inroad into it. And everyone thinks of Julie as a visualist, and she's an extraordinary visualist, but for Julie, her inroad was the music and the expansion of the South African sound. And it was really pulling Lebo in, which is why in every production except Japan of The Lion King, there is always a component of South African performers because it's so much a part of it. And that became, what did you ask me actually?
What are the biggest challenges of translating
Yeah,
to theater?
yeah, it's finding out what the musical language and how the music works in it. And on that one, it just was all about the music, and then everything joined around it. And I get called every day by someone who wants, because I've become just the gatekeeper of all the Disney titles, and there's many things that I'm uninterested in doing. Of course, you can't do it all, and a lot of them I think are terrible ideas to be musicals. But people call every day because they want a Disney title that they can turn into a musical. And you'd be startled to know who wants to make things into a musical because they think if it says Disney and you have them sing, you have a better shot, which is absurd to me, you know. I could make a long list of things that are terrible ideas. Terrible, terrible, terrible ideas.
And this is why this man is the most knowledgeable man in showbiz.
That was our last question. You okay? Do you want more? You get enough?
That seems terrific.
Cool.
Thank you. Thanks for hanging.